Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know, we love to go deep on this show, and today we're going deep on a figure who's been kind of hard to miss in the news lately, J.D. Vance.
Yeah, definitely a fascinating guy. And
Yeah.
yeah, but a lot of people know him from his book Hillbilly Elegy, but his story goes way beyond that now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we've got excerpts from a paper here that really digs into Vance's whole journey from his Appalachian roots to his kind of surprising political turns. You know, he's gone in some directions I don't think a lot of people expected.
Right. And I mean, his story really kind of captures some of the biggest changes that we've seen in American culture and politics over the last, decade or so.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So let's rewind back to the beginning. Hillbilly Elegy. It was huge when it came out back in 2016. Why do you think that book resonated with so many people, especially during such a, crazy election year?
Well, I think you have to remember the context.
Yeah.
This was right when we were hearing a lot about the Rust Belt,
Yeah.
those parts of the Midwest and the Northeast that were hit really hard by factory closures.
Yeah.
And Hillbilly Elegy. It kind of put a human face on those struggles. There's Vance wrote very openly about growing up poor in Ohio, dealing with addiction in his family, and just this constant feeling of being stuck.
Yeah, it felt very real. A lot of readers felt like he was speaking directly to their own experiences, that sense of being left behind the American dream, feeling kind of out of reach.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about like the economic hardships. He also talked about these cycles of poverty and social dysfunction that were so hard to escape. Like chaos and instability almost became normal.
Yeah, that's what's so striking about that book. It's brutally honest in a lot of ways, even dark. But there's also this thread of resilience, like Vance himself manages to break free. He joins the Marines, goes to Ohio State, then ends up at Yale Law School. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the part that gave a lot of people hope. It felt like a roadmap out of despair. It really tapped into that classic American ideal of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, even when the odds are stacked against you.
Totally. Okay, so then we get to 2016, and here's where things get interesting. Because Vance was a really strong critic of Donald Trump at first. He even called him an idiot at one point.
He did. He did, yeah. He was really concerned about Trump's rhetoric.
Yeah.
He called it divisive and dangerous. This was before Trump even took office.
Right.
And you could tell Vance was disillusioned with, like, the whole political establishment in general.
Mm-hmm.
But he definitely didn't think that Trump was the answer.
Okay, so then what changed? How did Vance go from idiot to, embracing Trump's policies?
Well, it's not a simple answer. Part of it, I think, was just growing disillusionment with those, like, traditional political elites.
Okay.
He felt like they just weren't addressing the real anxieties that a lot of working class Americans were feeling.
Yeah.
And by 2018, he was starting to echo some of Trump's criticisms, about globalization and trade deals,
Interesting.
arguing that they were hurting American workers.
So it's like maybe he started to see some common ground with Trump's agenda, even if he still didn't like Trump's style.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's almost like he was saying, okay, I really don't like the messenger, but maybe the message has some merit.
Right.
And it's important to remember this was all happening while the opioid crisis was getting worse. It was hitting communities. Like, Vance is really hard.
Yeah.
And he was really angry that he felt like the establishment politicians weren't doing enough to help.
Right. So this is where it starts to get even more interesting to me. Because Vance's shift, it wasn't just about agreeing with a couple of policies.
Yeah.
He became a full-blown Trump ally, campaigning for him, really embracing that kind of populist rhetoric.
Yeah. And, his background, his personal story made him a really powerful advocate for that message.
Yeah.
Like, here's this Yale-educated lawyer who's experienced poverty firsthand saying, hey, this guy, Trump, gets it. He understands our struggles.
It's like he was saying, look, I might not like everything about Trump, but he's the only one who's actually willing to shake things up and fight for the forgotten Americans.
Right, exactly. And Vance wasn't afraid to tap into some of that anger and resentment that was brewing. He was hitting hard on things like outsourcing unfair trade deals, the threat from China.
And for people who already felt ignored and marginalized, that message really resonated. I mean, it's almost like he was giving them permission to be angry, to blame someone for their problems.
Yeah, and that's where we start to see him walking this really fine line.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, he was tapping into some legitimate economic anxieties that people were feeling.
Yeah.
But to do that, he sometimes aligned himself with some of Trump's more divisive rhetoric. Remember, this is the same guy who was criticizing that very same rhetoric just a couple of years earlier.
It's like he made a calculated decision,
Yeah.
to reach these voters, I have to speak their language, even if it means using some of the same tactics that I used to condemn.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
Critics would probably say he was just chasing power and willing to say whatever it took to gain influence.
Hmm.
And some of his statements were definitely inflammatory.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like that whole thing about childless Democratic leaders being miserable. I mean, come on, what does that even have to do with anything?
Yeah, it felt very much like a personal attack, more than an actual political argument.
Totally. And then there were those claims about Haitian migrants bringing diseases into the country.
Right, those claims were completely unfounded, and they really played into some dangerous stereotypes about immigrants.
Yeah.
And it's especially striking when you remember that Vance's wife, Usha, is the daughter of Indian immigrants.
It's true. It makes it so complex because he has this personal connection to the immigrant experience, but he's also willing to use these harmful tropes for political gain.
It really highlights the contradictions in his persona.
Mm,
Like he's this champion of the working class, but he's also aligning himself with policies that could actually harm a lot of the people he claims to represent.
right. Do you think he genuinely believed those things he was saying about immigrants? Or was it more about trying to appeal to a specific audience? It's tough to say for sure. But it definitely raised questions about his authenticity. It created this perception that he was willing to exploit people's fears and prejudices just to get ahead.
Yeah, and that's hard to come back from. Once that sticks, even if you have good intentions,
Mm,
that kind of rhetoric can do real damage. It creates this climate of distrust and division where it's even harder to talk about these issues productively.
absolutely. And we see this happening over and over again in politics. Politicians use these divisive tactics because they work, at least in the short term. They can mobilize their base, energize voters. But over time, it erodes trust in institutions, and it makes it really hard to find common ground.
Yeah, it's a dangerous game. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Vance's journey from Trump critic to Trump ally and some of the controversies along the way. But there's another important figure in this story, his wife, Usha. You mentioned earlier that she's the daughter of Indian immigrants, which makes his stance on immigration even more interesting. Yeah, she's a really fascinating person in her own right. She's a Yale law grad, clerked for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and has had a very successful legal career. She's often described as a strong, independent woman who's not afraid to speak her mind.
And how do you think she's influenced Vance's path?
Well, she seems to be like a stabilizing force in his life. You know, someone who can offer a different perspective and helps him kind of navigate the world of politics.
Right.
And there have been reports that she played a big role in his decision to run for the Senate. And she's very visible on the campaign trail.
So Vance often talks about the importance of family, how his own upbringing shaped his values. Do you think Usha's background and experiences have had any influence on his views on family policy, for example?
That's a good question. Vance has been critical of some welfare programs. He argues that they can create dependency. But he's also talked about the need for policies that support working families, like affordable childcare and paid family leave. It's possible that Usha's perspective, coming from an immigrant family that faced its own challenges, might have softened some of his views.
Right. So maybe it's not as simple as just being pro-family or anti-government assistance. Maybe it's about finding that balance between individual responsibility and creating a safety net that actually helps people.
Right, and that's a nuance that often gets lost in all the political back and forth. People's lives are complicated, their needs are diverse. A one-size-fits-all approach rarely works.
So true. Okay, so zooming out a bit, where does all of this leave J.D. Vance today? He went from being this voice of the struggling working class to a pretty controversial political figure who's made some questionable choices. Is he still seen as a potential leader?
Well, he's only 40 years old, and he's already had a pretty remarkable rise in politics. Yeah. He's got name recognition, a compelling personal story, and he can definitely connect with voters on an emotional level.
And he definitely made an impression during that vice presidential debate against Tim Walz.
He did. He came across as very confident, articulate, and challenged the Biden administration's record on things like immigration and the economy. He was tapping into that same populist energy that fueled his Senate campaign, and it clearly resonated with some voters.
But there was that awkward moment when he was asked about whether he thought Trump lost the 2020 election, and his refusal to give a straight answer was pretty telling.
It was, yeah, and it raised some questions about his judgment and whether he's willing to challenge Trump, even when it's clear that Trump's claims are baseless. That kind of blind loyalty worries some people.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, is he just another Trump loyalist, or is there something more to him than that?
Right, that's the big question. Can he establish his own identity within a party that's still very much under Trump's influence, or is he always going to be tied to the man who helped him get where he is today?
It's a tough spot to be in. And it makes you wonder, what does J.D. Vance actually stand for? Are there some core principles driving his decisions, or is it more about ambition and political strategy? It's a question a lot of people are asking. Is he someone who can actually make a difference in people's lives, or is he just really good at playing the political game?
And the answer might be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
He's clearly talented at tapping into people's anxieties and frustrations, and he knows how to articulate those feelings in a way that resonates, especially with people who feel like the system has failed them.
But the way he's chosen to do that is what bothers some people. Aligning himself with Trump, using divisive rhetoric, making unfounded claims. It's turned off a lot of people who might have been sympathetic to his message.
Yeah, he's become a polarizing figure for sure. And that's the big challenge for him now. Can he broaden his appeal beyond just the Trump base? Can he convince voters that he's more than just a Trump follower?
So let's bring it back to you. What are the big takeaways you're walking away with after this deep dive into J.D. Vance's world?
Well, I think his story really highlights how divided American society is right now. The economic anxiety, the cultural clashes, the erosion of trust in institutions. It's all there in Vance's journey.
And it's not just about him, right? It's about the millions of people he represents, the folks who feel left behind, forgotten, and angry.
Exactly. And it raises some really important questions about the future of American politics. Can we find a way to bridge these divides? Can we have real conversations about these complex issues without resorting to fear and division?
Because if we can't, it's hard to see how we move forward as a country. It just becomes this toxic cycle of resentment and polarization where compromise feels impossible and the loudest voices win regardless of the truth.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering thought. And it makes you wonder, what role will figures like J.D. Vance play in shaping that future? Will they be part of the solution, or will they just keep exploiting those divisions for their own benefit?
That's a question we all have to think about, not just as, political observers, but as citizens. What do we want our politics to look like? What kind of leaders do we want?
And what are we willing to do to create a more just and equitable society for everyone? Because ultimately, that's what's at stake. It's not about winning elections. It's about creating a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from Vance's childhood in Appalachia to his rise in politics. And it's clear his story's not over yet. He's a complex guy full of contradictions and ambitions, and he's definitely tapped into something very real in the American psyche.
So as you continue to follow his journey, here's something to think about. Does J.D. Vance represent a new kind of leadership for a changing America? Or is he just a symptom of the deeper problems that we face as a nation?
It's a great question, and I hope this deep dive is giving you some new things to think about. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.
Yeah, it's a tough position to be in for sure. Kind of makes you wonder, what does J.D. Vance really stand for?
Right.
Is there like a set of principles that are guiding his choices? Or is it more about ambition and, just trying to get ahead in politics?
That's the question a lot of people are asking, right? Is he the real deal? Someone who actually wants to make a difference in people's lives? Or is he just really good at playing the game?
And the answer might be a little bit of both. I mean, he's clearly got a talent for connecting with people, understanding their anxieties and frustrations, and he's really good at putting those feelings into words in a way that people respond to, especially those who feel like the system has let them down.
But for some people, it's the way he's gone about doing that that's troubling. Aligning himself with Trump, using that kind of divisive language, making claims that aren't backed up by evidence. It's alienated a lot of people who might have been on his side.
Yeah, it's definitely made him a polarizing figure. And that's the challenge for him moving forward. Can he broaden his appeal beyond just those core Trump supporters? Can he convince people that he's more than just a Trump guy?
So let's bring it back to you. What are the big takeaways you're walking away with after going deep on J.D. Vance?
Well, I think his story is a really good example of how divided we are as a country right now. All the economic anxiety, the cultural clashes, the fact that people don't trust institutions anymore, it's all